On May 15, 2006, the weather on Everest was near perfect. Blue skies, light winds, and stable snow conditions so rare that dozens of climbers seized the opportunity. More than 40 people would stand on the summit that day, celebrating the ultimate mountaineering dream. But not everyone returned. British climber David Sharp was found sitting motionless inside a small rocky alcove near the summit route, a place known grimly as the Green Boots Cave. While climbers passed him on their way up and down, David sat there freezing to death, still alive but unable to move. As the sun rose higher and the summit traffic continued, one question began to echo around the world. How could so many climbers reach the top while one man was dying just meters away? Was it that no one noticed, that no one could help, or was it something darker, reflection of the ruthless choices that the death zone forces people to make? David Sharp's death is not just a story of one man's failed summit attempt. It is a story that forces us to confront the ethics of Everest itself. David Sharp was not a reckless amateur chasing glory. Born in England in 1972, he grew up fascinated by exploration and the limits of human endurance. He studied engineering at Nottingham University, but it was the mountains that truly captured his heart. Friends described him as quiet, thoughtful, and intensely determined, a man who preferred action to words. By his early 30s, David had already built an impressive climbing resume. He had summited Cho'oyu, the sixth highest mountain in the world, and attempted Everest once before in 2003. That expedition had ended short of the summit, but it planted a seed of unfinished business. Unlike many Everest clients who join expensive guided expeditions, David was determined to climb in his own way, low cost, self-reliant, and without the extensive support of Sherpas or high-priced guides. This decision reflected his personality, independent, idealistic, and committed to climbing on his own terms. In 2006, he returned to Everest under the banner of the Asian Trekking Budget Expedition, which provided permits and logistics but little direct support on the mountain. His plan was ambitious and extremely risky. Attempt the summit without bottled oxygen, alone, relying on his experience and willpower. For David, this was not just about standing on the top of the world. It was about proving something deeply personal, that a climber with skill and determination, even without money or fame, could stand among the giants of mountaineering. But Everest has little regard for personal ideals, and the mountain was about to test his convictions in the most brutal way possible. To understand David Sharp's fate, we need to understand the mountain in 2006. That spring season on Everest was one of the busiest in history. Dozens of commercial expeditions had gathered on the north side of the mountain in Tibet, drawn by the promise of a stable weather window in mid-May. For many climbers, Everest had become less of an expedition and more of a business. Commercial guiding companies offered packages that ranged from $30,000 to $80,000, providing Sherpa support, bottled oxygen, and carefully prepared routes. With money, almost anyone in reasonable shape could attempt the summit. That year, more than 400 climbers had permits. On May 15th, the forecast showed nearly perfect summit conditions, and everyone wanted their chance. The result? A massive wave of climbers moving up the mountain at the same time, creating dangerous traffic jams in the death zone where every extra minute at altitude eats away at your body. On the north side, where David Sharp was climbing, the route funneled through narrow sections like the infamous second step, where lines of climbers formed, each waiting their turn to ascend the fixed ropes. It was here, in these choke points, that the mentality of the mountain became clear. Every climber was focused on their own survival and their own summit goal. The atmosphere was electric, filled with summit fever. Months of preparation and tens of thousands of dollars had gone into these attempts. For many, turning back was unthinkable. But Everest does not care about money, ambition, or dreams. It is the thin air and brutal cold that decide who lives and who dies. And amid this wave of determined climbers moving toward the top, one man, David Sharp, was falling behind, alone and in desperate need of help. Dozens of people would pass him. Few would stop. David Sharp set out from his high camp on the north side of Everest during the night of May 14th, aiming to reach the summit by morning. Unlike most around him, he carried little bottled oxygen, no Sherpa partner, and only the most basic support from his expedition organizer. It was, in every sense, a solitary climb. For David, this approach was intentional. He believed in the purity of mountaineering stripped of commercial excess, relying on one's own strength and judgment. But on Everest, especially in the death zone above 8,000 meters, that purity comes with a deadly cost. As he ascended, other climbers from better equipped teams overtook him. They moved faster with Sherpa assistance and supplemental oxygen, while David's pace slowed. By the time the bulk of climbers were pushing toward the summit ridge, David was far behind schedule, struggling against fatigue and the thin air. Late in the day, he reached a shallow limestone alcove just below a landmark that every Everest climber knows, the body of Green Boots, a frozen reminder of Everest dangers. David stopped there to rest, sheltered slightly from the wind. But as the hours dragged on, exhaustion overtook him. His oxygen supply limited as it was ran low, and without a partner to push him forward, he remained in that cave as night closed in. By the time time other climbers passed on their way to the summit in the early morning hours of May 15th, David was still there. He was not yet gone. Several would later recall seeing him sitting upright, breathing shallowly, his face covered in frostbite, but he was in grave trouble. And so began one of the most haunting dilemmas in mountaineering history. While dozens climbed past David on their way to the top, he remained in the cave alive, but abandoned. As dawn broke on May 15th, climbers moving toward the summit of Everest's north side passed through the narrow section near Green Boots Cave. There, sitting against the wall of rock, was David Sharp. He was still alive. Several climbers reported seeing him moving faintly, his face blackened by frostbite, his breathing shallow and labored. Some thought he was resting. Others realized he was in serious trouble, but few stopped for more than a moment. In the death zone, every decision is magnified by the brutal conditions. The temperature hovered around 40 degrees C, and the air carried only one-third of the oxygen found at sea level. Stopping for too long could mean losing your own summit chance or your life. One team, a group of Indian climbers, spent the longest time with David. They tried to rouse him, shouting and shaking him, but he was unresponsive. Without spare oxygen or the strength to physically move him down the mountain, they made the agonizing decision to continue upward. Hours later, as those same climbers descended, they found him in the exact same spot now, barely alive. Again, they tried to help. Again, there was nothing they could do. David was too far gone, and they were too exhausted to carry him. By the end of that day, more than 40 climbers had walked past David Sharp. Some may not have realized he was still alive. Others convinced themselves that nothing could be done. On Everest, such rationalizations are common because in the death zone, even the smallest act of aid can jeopardize your own survival. When the summit traffic cleared and the mountain fell quiet again, David remained where he had been for hours, alone, exposed, and fading into unconsciousness. He drew his last breaths in that small rocky cave. The same day that Everest celebrated dozens of new summits, one man's lonely struggle ended in silence. The haunting question after David Sharp's death was simple: why didn't anyone save him? On the surface, the answer seems cold. Dozens of climbers passed him while he was still alive, but the reality is more complicated. At over 8,500 meters, in the death zone, the human body is shutting down. Every step is exhausting. Every decision is clouded by hypoxia. Carrying another person even a few meters can be nearly impossible. Many of the climbers who saw David assumed he was beyond rescue. By the time they found him, his frostbite was severe, his movements minimal, and he was already hypothermic. Without immediate oxygen and a team strong enough to drag him down, the odds of survival were slim. But there was also something else at play: summit fever. Climbers had spent tens of thousands of dollars, years of preparation, and weeks on the mountain waiting for the single weather window. To stop and turn back would mean losing their only chance at the summit. In that moment, ambition often outweighed compassion. It's a brutal truth of Everest. In the death zone, morality bends under the weight of survival. What seems unthinkable at sea level, walking past a dying man, becomes disturbingly common at 8,500 meters. For David Sharp, it meant that even as dozens celebrated their triumph, his life slipped quietly away just meters from the trail. When news of David Sharp's death reached the world, it ignited a firestorm. Headlines accused climbers of leaving a man to die so they could chase their own glory. Mountaineering forums exploded with debates about responsibility, ethics, and the cost of ambition. Was Everest no longer about exploration, but about selfishness at any cost? Even Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to stand on Everest's summit, condemned what had happened. He called it horrifying that so many climbers had walked past a dying man without attempting a full-scale rescue. To him, mountaineering was about solidarity and survival, not personal achievement at the expense of others. Expedition leaders pushed back. They argued that in the death zone, rescue is often impossible. Carrying a man down from above 8,500 meters can take dozens of climbers, all risking their own lives. Some insisted that Sharp was already beyond saving when most teams saw him. In their eyes, climbers had made a grim but realistic choice. Still, David's story resonated because it exposed the uncomfortable truth about Everest's commercialization. For many, the mountain had become less about adventure and more about success at any cost. The image of dozens celebrating their summit while one man froze to death in plain sight became a symbol of everything critics said was wrong with modern Everest. In the months that followed, expedition companies began reviewing their protocols. Some placed stricter limits on solo climbers. Others emphasized teamwork and decision-making, hoping to prevent similar tragedies. Yet, even today, the ethical question lingers: when every ounce of strength is needed to survive, how much responsibility does one climber owe another? David Sharp's death did more than claim a life. It forced the mountaineering world to look in the mirror. David Sharp's story remains one of Everest's most haunting tragedies, not just because he died, but because of how he died. alone, in plain sight, while others push past him toward their own goals. It forces us to ask, what is the true cost of a summit? Is it measured in glory, photographs, and flags on the roof of the world, or in the lives left behind along the way? On Everest, climbers face impossible decisions. In the death zone, where every breath is a struggle, morality is no longer black and white. But David's fate stands as a reminder that mountains test not only the limits of our endurance, but also the limits of our humanity. Dozens of climbers reached the summit that day. Their names are footnotes in history, but David Sharp's name endures, not as a symbol of triumph, but as a warning of what happens when ambition blinds us to compassion. Everest will always inspire, but it will also always demand. And sometimes, as David's story shows, the price it asks is far greater than we are prepared to pay.